The 30th UN Climate Conference, COP30, is underway in Brazil. But this time, there's a big difference. The United States isn't at the table. Having pulled out of the Paris Agreement, the US is now watching from the sidelines, and that absence is being felt. Across the conference halls, there's a growing sense of disappointment and alarm. The world's goal of keeping temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's slipping out of reach. Not only has the US stepped back, it is actively pushing against global climate action. One battleground: international shipping. At the International Maritime Organization or IMO, efforts to set global decarbonization rules ran into a wall, with the US leading the charge to stall them, backed by a few powerful allies.
Just as any sector, any industrial sector, shipping is also faced with this prospect or this requirement to decarbonize because of climate change concerns. And just as in any other field, shipping is also prone to geopolitical tensions. And given the current reversal of stand by the United States against climate change and against any action to mitigate climate change, the shipping decarbonization is also facing challenges, the program. In shipping, especially global shipping, unlike other industries where national mandates are far more important, in shipping, there is a nodal agency called the International Maritime Organization. It is part of the UN and sort of is very close to the UN Charter of providing global governance. The IMO sets the standards, the IMO sets guidelines. Actually, these are mandates and laws. And member states who are part of the IMO then come and pass legislation in keeping with whatever is decided in the IMO to implement what the IMO is saying. So the IMO is a little different from other UN agencies. It has much power. It is regulatory, and it's located in London, where the international shipping finance and shipping insurance and many other aspects of global shipping are located. The IMO has been debating and discussing decarbonization for a while now. They have set very specific mandates. They started with imposing mandates on ships plying across the world to improve the efficiency and thereby reducing fuel consumption. And then they had a program to start using alternative fuels from 2030 onwards. And then by 2050, the goal was to reach net zero, which means ships plying across the world will use fuels that will lead to net zero carbon emissions. It's a very ambitious target. And once the efficiency mandates were implemented, the IMO was faced with the prospect of having to legislate on what sort of limits will be set on ships that are burning fossil fuels, and those ships that are not burning these fuels, what other things will there be? Penalties? Should they pay a fine, or should there be a market-based mechanism? Well, some months back, there was a meeting at the IMO, and the IMO, there was a broad consensus on how to implement this. And in that, India played a key role. They suggested a market-based mechanism that would collect money from ships that are not complying with the standards and create a pool. India called it a bridging mechanism. And eventually what Singapore came out with was accepted. And that proposal was to be put to vote.
On October 17, delegates from more than 100 countries gathered to vote on a net zero framework, a plan that would put a carbon price on fossil fuel use in ships. But the session turned chaotic. Many delegates weren't even sure what they were voting on. As the confusion grew, two newly arrived US delegates could be heard loudly campaigning against the proposal. In the end, the result? Another delay. A resolution to postpone the decision by a year passed 57 to 29. The question of how or whether shipping will go green is still unresolved.
Yeah, it was a very important moment in shipping regulation and climate regulation in general, because what should have been a formality, the adoption of this net zero framework that had been approved with a large majority of 63 to 16 votes only 6 months ago, were never happened because the room agreed, or the chair agreed with Saudi Arabia and Singapore's proposal to instead take a roll call vote on just adjourning the whole meeting for 1 year. And the process was pretty chaotic, and at times it was like countries didn't even know what they were being asked to vote on. Was it adopting the framework? Was it changing the rules for adopting the framework? Or was it kicking it all down the road? So we've been waiting for this final adoption process for months and years now, and it's the culmination of almost decades of work between countries on how we can use market-based measures to decarbonize international shipping. So in terms of those efforts, it's a major setback. So most of the regulations on ships will be to do with safety features, will be to do with environment measures, will be to do with the welfare of seafarers. But the greenhouse gas issue has been threatening to tear apart the IMO for a while, and there are many within the organization and diplomats and scientists who have always worried privately and told me that they wonder if the issue is simply too big for this organization. It's it's so contentious because it involves countries having to pay a tax to an international body, presumably run by the UN, but we don't exactly know. And they wouldn't have exact 100% control over how that money is spent. So that is a major barrier for countries, particularly the United States, which has never agreed to, to that kind of a tax in any form. Although you said, is it unprecedented? Well, for the IMO, I wish I could say that, but the organization, because it works by consensus, all of the 176 countries have to agree together to get anything done. Whatever they agree to do takes a really, really long time. And it's not the first time that Saudi Arabia, the US, Russia have pulled some sort of procedural card out at virtually the last minute and inserted some loophole into the rules, or kicked it away for further consideration, or otherwise managed to avoid agreeing on rules that would mean higher costs for their economies.
So now, the world's shipping nations have 1 more year to decide. Will they commit to decarbonizing? And if yes, who pays the bill? How much and where does the money go? It's a deja vu from the Paris Agreement days, full of ambition but bogged down in politics and cost sharing debates.
There is consensus, true consensus, on what the goal is, which is bringing shipping to net zero by or around 2050. The IMO actually agreed something called its 2023 revised greenhouse gas strategy, which was like its grand plan for the future. And all of the countries agreed to that, and that's now it's an official goal of the organization, even though it's not legally binding technically. So while they don't have to come up with an exact law to meet the goals of that, they do need to do something, or at least be seen to do something about that. And that was pretty revolutionary, because there's no world in which you can decarbonize shipping without it becoming more expensive for someone. But the goal is to have a fair and equitable regulation that charges, in theory, a very small amount on marine fuel across the board, with all countries contributing, and then raising huge amounts of money to go into things like green R&D, and also on a separate track to spend money helping countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, particularly what they call small island developing states, such as in the Pacific Islands, and least developed countries, such as in places like sub-Saharan Africa, who don't have the capacity to build ports with alternative fuel capability for cargo ships and that kind of thing. So probably the 2023 strategy was absolutely revolutionary, especially if you followed the IMO and you see how tense it can get. And we got a major breakthrough, I would say 6 months ago, when China agreed to this net zero framework that we've been discussing, because that involves paying money. The key contentious thing that a lot of countries who maybe have different views on the importance of climate change versus other concerns, usually their red line is like, I will agree to do research, I will agree to work towards vague ambitions, but if you come looking for actual money, that's where it gets harder. But China voted 6 months ago to approve the strategy, and that came with a kind of implicit idea that there would be some kind of tax mechanism. Now, of course, once Donald Trump got heard of the words carbon tax, things changed pretty quickly. I can go into exactly how if you like, or do a bit more background, but let me know.
Go ahead, but just one point of clarification. So much of the money that will be raised to transition to green fuels, will it come from taxing the fuel use, or will there be other sources of raising the money?
It would come from under the net zero framework, and really most of the plans that are realistically being looked at as alternatives or have been looked at in the past. It would come from essentially companies would have to count their emissions, measure their fuel use, plug the numbers in, and then come up with a carbon intensity figure, essentially how green or dirty is the amount of transport work that their ship has done, get that number for the year, and then they would have to send that number to the IMO. And if they were above the line, or if their emissions were higher than they should be, they would have to pay some sort of penalty for the distance. And if they were greener than normal, they would get some kind of reward. So it's a weird, complicated scheme, a bit like an emissions trading system. It's a bit like a carbon tax, and nobody really wants to call it anything hard, because once you specify that it is a carbon tax, you're going to turn a lot of people off. So, but it would essentially come from pricing CO2, and if you burn 1 ton of heavy marine fuel oil, which is very dirty stuff, you release about 3 tons of CO2. So it would also include other greenhouse gas emissions, which are very important, such as methane, which comes from burning gas, and nitrous oxide, which is not as common, but it's 300 times stronger per ton than CO2. So it also was pretty revolutionary because it agreed to measure this on a life cycle basis. So not just the emissions that come out of the smokestack from the ship, but all of the emissions that you get by drilling that fuel, processing it, transporting it, getting it to the ship, liquefying it if it's LNG, always takes energy.
Usually, IMO meetings are calm, technical, and all about consensus. But this one, it was different, charged, political, and divided.
And the US, in conjunction with Saudi Arabia and Russia and a few other countries, just mounted this extraordinary campaign by IMO standards, which is usually very reserved and polite and boring and diplomatic. They went in every angle they could. They opposed even adopting the meeting agenda, which has nothing to do with the actual vote, but just to communicate, to stall, to throw the process off track, because these meetings they can't go more than a certain length because of the rules. So So there was delaying tactics, and we also heard there was bullying, threats, cajoling behind the scenes by negotiators, um, as well as from their national capitals, trying to convince swing voting countries, such as particularly from Africa and the Caribbean and the Pacific Islands, who don't usually turn up or say very much at IMO meetings, trying to get them to waver and to back down from supporting this net zero framework. We heard there were calls to the heads of national shipping companies. Officials have been threatened with more difficult visa access to the United States should they ever try and go there. And pretty much from the outset, as soon as the Trump administration became aware of this and the fact that it could actually become a binding carbon tax, there were they threatened any country that voted in support of it with tariffs, with trade retaliation, various ominous other things, and this really caused a fairly toxic atmosphere throughout the week. It caught a lot of the proponents of this regulation off guard. The integrity and the impartiality of the chair of the IMO Secretariat, which is usually a sacred cow, and the overarching theme of last week was it paints a very distressing and worrying picture for the future of these kind of global efforts on climate change, but also on other issues, if that consensus-based model and that spirit of friendly debate and cooperation is to be undermined. It had a lot of people, even if they didn't support this net zero framework, because plenty of countries had big problems with it, and there's a lot that we're not sure how it would work, but it was our main chance at getting a global regulation instead of each country or different regions, such as the European Union, coming up with their own carbon taxes. And if there's a patchwork of overlapping regional regulations, that just makes it difficult for industry, probably doesn't raise enough to help us research the fuels of the future, and certainly means that the poorest states don't get their share. This isn't just a handshake deal. This isn't just an agreement to love each other and hug a puppy. This is binding international law that would change the whole course of probably climate regulation. So it's a huge missed opportunity when you view it from that lens.
Okay. You said that the IMO was being a world government because nations wanted it. That's how the business was conducted by and large at the IMO. But the Trump administration, the guerrilla tactics they use elsewhere, they brought it to the IMO, which is not used to this, something like this. And you made the point that they kind of wrecked the session.
So, what does all this mean for India? How prepared is Indian ship for a low carbon future? Globally, merchant ships run on fuels like low sulfur oil and diesel. To hit net zero targets, the industry is looking at green fuels like green methanol and green ammonia, both carbon neutral. Other alternatives like bio LNG are also in play.
Insofar as India is concerned, you're correct. In the last meeting in April, which I think was in second week of April, 7th to 11th or something, India did play a major role in bringing about the market-based mechanism into play. So if you look at in a little different context, if you move this aspect aside and keep in mind the fact that 80% of world's trade moves by the seas. Okay. Now, if you look at emissions sector-wise, shipping as a whole, if you look at it, is roughly between 2.89 to 3%, depending upon which publication you're reading and where the stats are taken from. But it's roughly around 3, you could say. Whereas harder to abate, or rather hard to abate sectors like steel, cement, and even agriculture for that matter, it's all in the double digits or close to double digits. Within transport, if you look at road, rail, and maritime thereafter. Road is much higher if you look at 24%. So actually there is a school of thought that whilst everybody, I'm not being the devil's advocate here. So there is a growing school of thought that whilst we need to target shipping, we need to probably prioritize steel, cement, and other industries. That said, we should also keep in context, since you asked me the Indian perspective, that insofar as the declared NDCs are concerned, nationally determined contributions, and our Panchamrit, which our Prime Minister has espoused, we are looking at net zero by 2070. So there is a 20-year gap in what the IMO wants and what we have publicly stated and what we are trying to attain. Now, insofar as shipping is concerned, it is not national. As we all know, it is international. And therefore, IMO being the international body, all efforts are being made by the government and the shipping industry to, align with this net zero. And that is why we have taken a very active part. So there is a growing school of thought that, whilst we need to target shipping, we need to probably prioritize steel, cement, and other industries. That said, we should also keep in context, since you asked me the Indian perspective, that insofar as the declared NDCs are concerned, nationally determined contributions, and our Panchamrit, which our Prime Minister has espoused, we are looking at net zero by 2070. So there is a 20-year gap in what the IMO wants and what we have publicly stated and what we are trying to attain. Now, insofar as shipping is concerned, it is not national. As we all know, it is international. And therefore, IMO being the international body, all efforts are being made by the government and the shipping industry to, align with this net zero. And that is why we have taken a very active part. There is today, if you speak, the supply demand, there is a mismatch in terms of quantities. There is a recent report, I'm not sure if you've read it. Maersk had to go back to gray methanol because green methanol was not available in adequate quantities. Maersk has bet big on methanol. Similarly, shipping lines in Southeast Asia have kind of bet big on ammonia. So there are two strands which are happening. Ammonia, insofar if you look at ammonia, the engine is in its trial stage. The technology is yet to mature. It will take a couple of more years. But you must keep in mind that with ammonia, the industry is used to handling ammonia. It is used to handling ammonia as a cargo because the use of ammonia in the fertilizer industry was huge. So
Yes.
the shipping industry per se is used to handling ammonia. Okay, now the question is of being used as a fuel. So there, the technology is yet to mature, but it is in its trials and testing stage. And some of these shipping lines have already bet on it and have ordered. Second aspect, which we need to be all very clear, is the ships that you order today. See, when you order a ship, you look at a minimum ship's life of 25 years. Okay, 25 to 28 years. And given the geopolitical scenario today, with the crisis in the Suez and otherwise, ship owners are actually continuing to exploit the ships. As a result of which, less ships are available for recycling. That will change soon because ships have kind of run out of their service life, but they're still being used. So when you look at this kind of a service life of 25 to 28 years, and you look at the build time of 2 to 3 years, and then the order book, so the ships that you order today are the ships that are going to be in service well into 2055, 56, 58, maybe up to 2060. That's the kind of time frame that you're looking at. So unless and until the shipping industry is clear as to which is the fuel that is going to be the fuel for the future, these orders are there is a huge amount of uncertainty. That is as far as the shipbuilding part is concerned. Now, if you look at bunkering, Singapore is quite a major hub for biofuels. Methanol, if you look at Europe, methanol is probably, China is building big on methanol. So now all these put together for India, and so far as bunkering is concerned, as far as part of our national green hydrogen mission, we've already announced that Kandla, Tuticorin, and Paradeep, we are going to have green hydrogen hubs. We are going ahead. We are going ahead with LNG hubs also. So all this, and LNG, mind you, is everybody's talking in the shipping industry as a transitional fuel because the methane slip factor is very, very high. Though there are technological advances being made insofar as containing the methane slip is concerned, and what came out in the earlier discussion, very true, Earlier, we were looking at tank to wake. Emissions were being looked at tank to wake. So,
Right.
so what is going to probably happen is in the immediate future, as I foresee, more focus probably needs to go into exhaust gas treatment, carbon capture technologies on board, improving the propulsive efficiencies, those kind of things which can give you some incremental improvements, if not big time changes. So that is how it is going to shape up, in the future. So we'll have to wait and watch. It's very difficult to put a finger and say onto something and say that this is going to be the fuel which is going to be the miracle of the future.
For India, the challenge is complex. The country doesn't own many ships, but Indian seafarers power the global fleet. They captain, operate, and manage ships around the world. So, any shift in shipping technology and regulation will directly affect Indian jobs and training. But the uncertainty at the global level is holding back business decisions. Shipping companies plan decades ahead, 20, sometimes even 30 years. And without clear rules, they can't move forward.
To get into this transition. What it means for a owner or a ship manager like Synergy is that we are managing these vessels, and when we move on to new kind of fuels, we need people who are trained for managing these kind of vessels, managing these kind of fuels. So it's not just the availability of fuels, availability of vessels, it's also the availability of manpower who can run these kind of vessels. So as a ship manager, we are looking into say how we can get first hand experience on running these vessels. Like we mentioned, we spoke about bio-LNG, methanol. There are these vessels which are on the seas now. However, one other fuel type that is not being discussed here is in detail is the biofuel or the drop-in fuels, which have a lower GHG intensity compared to the to the other fuels that I mentioned. So handling these fuels, these have a low shelf life. I mean, they need to be consumed soon. So handling these kind of fuels, being ready to manage these kind of vessels is what something that Synergy is looking into. That was about managing vessels, but when you take over such vessels, you also need to understand the technology, how the vessel is being built. Synergy is also involved in a lot of shipbuilding activities, retrofit activities. I'm heading a business unit called Azola, which helps in retrofitting these vessels. So our aim, our intention, and our core competency is that we support ship owners in building those vessels or converting those vessels to say zero carbon emitting vessels, and at the same time help improve the efficiency of vessels. Like it was just mentioned that it's also the incremental thing that needs to be looked into. When we talk about these fuels, these future fuels, these are going to be more expensive than the current fossil fuels, and that's one of the reasons why we are talking about penalties. It's to bridge the gap between the fossil fuels and these expensive fuels. Somebody has to pay for it. So if you're not bridging this gap, these fuels will never come into play. So there has to be a commercial and a compliance kind of a pressure to adopt these fuels. There will be some early movers like Maersk or the big names who will adopt these kind of fuels. But for the other players, there needs to be a level playing field, and that's why these regulations are quite important in the sense that you bridge the gap between the price of these fuels. So for Synergy or for Azola, our key priority is that we keep ourselves ahead of the curve, understand the technologies, understand how things are changing. The landscape is ever changing, so we need to be ready with the right kind of people, right kind of training, right kind of procedures in place. So that's what we are working towards.
Meanwhile, countries that are committed to climate action are pushing ahead. Ships docking at their ports may soon face strict emission limits. Others, bound for nations like the US, might not. And as long as Donald Trump remains in the office, there is a real chance that the global shipping decarbonization could stay stuck, dead in the water.